My guest today is Dr. Theresa Bullard. Dr. Bullard has her PhD in physics from the University of Washington and uses her knowledge of physics to explain and apply consciousness in a rather unique way. She does so through the ancient teachings in the lineage of King Solomon, which is part of the Western esoteric spiritual tradition. Dr. Bullard has a deep knowledge and training in the Western Esoteric Mystery School, which has long blended science and spirituality towards understanding the relationship between consciousness and matter. Dr. Bullard is featured on Gaia TV and hosts her own podcast where she teaches principles and applications of metaphysics, physics, and consciousness. Dr. Bullard, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, pleasure's all mine. I was a big fan of your mom, and I'm looking forward to finding all about your work. It seems like you have done an amazing job up there, so I want to dive right into it. And so many of the guests that I have on this program present their research in all things psi and metaphysical, and it usually begins with their training in science. And you pursued your career doing experimental research in neutrino physics, atomic physics, quantum physics. I'm really curious to know how you got going in the field of metaphysics and the things that you teach now, like Kabbalah. How did that happen for you?
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. There's two major pieces to it. Number one, my mother, Barbara Bullard, who was into things like the Monroe Institute, exploring consciousness, Edgar Cayce studies. So I grew up with a lot of exposure, let's say. And so I was raised to have an open mind to begin with. My parents never really imposed upon any of us what their belief system was. So they really just let us explore. Right. Only when we asked questions would they then share their own ideas and beliefs about things. And so I think, just from being exposed, it prepared me for the openness to the possibilities. Mm-hmm. But when I was young, I, especially as a teenager, I wasn't really into the woo-woo. I was very practical, very grounded, sports, academics, pursue the career in academia. Right. And I ultimately worked my way into science. I started off with wanting to do astronomy, which then the university I chose, University of Denver to begin with, said, well, we don't really have astronomy as major, but you could do physics and then go on to graduate school and do astrophysics. And so that's kind of what I did, although I went into neutrino physics in graduate school to begin with. And while I was in my second year, so I was very much immersed into the left brain scientific way of approaching things. I always had this sort of spiritual philosophy, just kind of a mishmash. I explored a lot. I didn't really gravitate towards any one tradition or religion or path or way of viewing things. I kind of picked the pieces that really felt right. And then it just informed my background philosophy and outlook of life. And then when I went into graduate school, though, I went from just sort of it was always there to all of a sudden I only had physics. It was 80 hours a week and I couldn't think of anything else because I didn't have time for anything else. So it was just left brain, 80 hours between classes, research, homework, testing, like all of this. And after my first year of being immersed in that world at such a high level, I found myself very out of balance after the year, and it sent me into a bit of a depression. Right. There was a part of me that was really essential that became starved because it wasn't being fed or nourished. And so then that set me on, and then graduate school ended up not being what I was hoping it would be. So it set me on a journey to discovering what was going to bring the balance and meaning back in. And I brought all these different aspects of life back in. I brought in the sports, I brought in social time, I brought in creative hobbies, I brought in all these things I had prior. Right. And they all helped. And another year goes by and it's like, okay, well, I feel more balanced, but something key is still missing. And then this little voice in my mind kind of came in and it said, well, there's one thing you haven't brought back in. And that one thing was spirituality. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I was actually very surprised because I was well indoctrinated into this scientific way of thinking. I was very surprised. Spirituality, really? Could that be it? Mm-hmm. But it was the only thing I had to go on at that point. So I dove in. And I thought, well, anything I'm going to try and pursue spiritually has to complement or at least not negate what I know to be true scientifically.
All right.
And so I've been to the research of science and consciousness, where quantum physics meets Eastern philosophy, whatever I could get my hands on at the time where the two kind of were juxtaposed. And I fell in love. It actually reminded me of why I went into physics in the first place, that it was actually maybe a deeper spiritual inspiration to understand the universe. And yet I forgot about that along the way, because we just get into the equations and the derivations and the practicalities of the science. So that set me on my spiritual journey, like where I really started to make it a priority in my life, versus it just sort of being there in the background informing my personal philosophy. It became something that I really made time for and dove into and knew this is a priority, because this brings purpose and meaning into my life.
Right. And that is incredibly important for balance. We all have that sense if we pay enough attention. So the Western esoteric tradition wasn't really a part of your upbringing, so to speak, but there was an openness to it. So the Kabbalah and what the Western esotericism in general is tailor-made for your mindset, your scientific mindset, especially because of the way that I consider it to be a pretty syncretic viewpoint of the relationship between consciousness and matter, for instance. And, it's very steeped in the Judeo-Christian philosophy, while simultaneously applying Jungian archetypes. And so I consider it to be like a psycho-spiritual type of discipline. Would you consider it the same way? How did you end up finding Kabbalah? Did it fall into your lap?
Yeah. So how I got into this path, because it definitely wasn't part of my upbringing. My upbringing was metaphysical, but it wasn't like Western mystery tradition. It wasn't that deep. It was more like Wayne Dyer and, some of these guys. And the way it was synchronicity. The universe guided me to it ultimately. At first I was like starving for community. I was waking up and getting really excited about this exploration of spirituality and physics, and how the two came together and the depths of that. And I wanted to explore, and I wanted people to talk to. And I was going to science and consciousness conferences. I came to them in Institute. I was going to expos. I was really trying to find community. I went to church, like Church of Religious Science, for the first time in 8 years. I found myself in a church because I was so hungry for community. And in all my searching, I wasn't quite finding the depth that I was, that was going to speak to me. And so at one point I got really frustrated. I was having a conversation with my mom over the phone, and I was kind of complaining about how alone I felt, and how I'm like, I feel like a fish out of water. Like I feel like I'm not, fitting in as, because I can't talk about this in the physics department, right? It's like big no. So I was really trying to find community. My mom just said, just put it out there to the universe. You want to find your family, your spiritual family, your tribe, and let it go.
That is so Barbara.
No. And then she said, just focus on your qualifying exams, and, just trust the universe and let it go. And I did. So I was like, all right, I can do that. And 2 weeks later, it only took 2 weeks before synchronicity brought me to somebody who was connected to the Modern Mystery School. It was too synchronistic to ignore. And so I went and had a session called a life activation. And I was asking all kinds of questions during the session. And I could feel the energy and whatnot, but it wasn't really what happened during the session as much as what happened afterwards. Well, that one session just started a process of unfolding in my life that I could see real sustaining changes and shifts at an inner plane, awareness, self-awareness, and things that, choices I was making on a daily basis, what was serving, what wasn't, and so forth. And it catalyzed, these shifts over several months worth, where I kept seeing it continuing to change this. Even 4 months down the line, I was like able for the first time to put the pieces together that, oh, this is my direction in life. Like I thought, well, I'm getting this PhD in physics, but I don't know what I want to do with it.
Right.
And 4 months after this life activation, I said, oh, I know what I want to do with this. I want to bring the science and the spirituality together. Now I know that I don't need to fit into the standard model in physics, for example. So it's just all these changes, and my quality of life really started to improve. And so I had this, I'll kind of take a long story, make it shorter. I had this intuitive call to just take further steps because I'd seen enough results. And so then I went and I got initiated into the modern mystery school where this life activation modality came from. And I took another level of training with them. And from that point forward, it was like my life sped up and everything accelerated. Like, and then when I was in the training, the initiation training in particular, that were answering questions that I had my whole life. I wasn't like verbalizing those questions, but I had seeking answers to them through so much of my search up to that point and never really finding satisfactory answers. And all of a sudden these answers were revealing themselves through these teachings. And I went, oh, wow, I've never thought of it that way, but that really resonates. That makes sense. And then it went deeper and it went deeper and deeper. And for me as a physicist, I was always asking questions, right? So I would poke at the holes in the teachings and, well, what about this and what about that? And how did these two things fit together? And so I really challenged them, my teachers in the mystery school, I challenged them. But in the end, I mean, I just saw that there was a deep, deep well of wisdom and knowledge and tools and practical application that we could take into our life that really made a difference. And they really worked. And it brought the realization to me that magic is real, and that there are ways, there are tools and techniques for expanding consciousness that have been on the planet for thousands of years, that ultimately the power is all within. And so I fell in love with it. And Kabbalah in particular came, like Kabbalah, Alchemy, Hermetics, they all kind of came in around the same time.
Right.
Well, Alchemy and Hermetics kind of came in right just prior, and then really dove into it through the mystery school. But Kabbalah, I had never heard of it before. And this is in 2001. And, I didn't know much about Jewish mysticism or anything. And I'd never heard of it before until they mentioned it in this initiation training. And every time they mentioned it, I would get a buzz. What they were saying would fly over the top of my head. So I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about, but intuitively I would get a buzz. Like, I got to know more. There's something here for me. And so I dove into it. And as you said, like it was like, whoa, this is what I've been looking for. Like, this is the template where I can bring the science and the consciousness and the personal growth and this psycho-spiritual, like everything comes together with Kabbalah and the Tree of Life. And then having also had a awakening into alchemy and the alchemical tradition, I saw how the two, lined up as well. And so, yeah, I fell in love, and it's like, oh, there's so much here.
Would it surprise you to know that you're not alone?
Yeah, no.
Every time I mention the Kabbalah, somebody's ears perk up. It always seems to grab somebody's interest. So I imagine that there's a lot of people listening, know nothing about Kabbalah. So for their benefit, why don't we unpack it a little bit? From your perspective, what is Kabbalah? How do you explain Kabbalah in under 5 minutes?
Well, I can do it in one line for you now.
Great. Yep.
One of the ways that we really like to say what is Kabbalah in the mystery school tradition that I study with is it is the study of life. And so it has to do with everything that we are, who we are, why we're here, what we're here for, where we come from, where we're going. Like, we're answering some of these big questions about life. And then in addition, it's about recognizing that the divine, that there is this eternal spiritual essence that is within us. And we want to draw that out. We want to alchemically bring that forward and manifest it more fully into this physical life. And it gives us lots of practical tools for how we can manifest, how we can harness our potentials and live a very full life with joy, with abundance, with magic, with all of this. to create a heaven on earth type of an experience. So
I
that would
know
be
exactly what you mean. I thought that was beautifully done, by the way. When people ask me what I think about it, I mean, the word Kabbalah obviously means to receive in Hebrew, but that brings up a lot of questions about what are you receiving. So I like to think about Kabbalah as you said, having to do with life. I add the word relationship. Everything involved in the study of the tree of life has to do with the relationship of polar opposites and bringing force and form into balance, which is what creates that magic. That's the
yeah.
way I think about it. And I think about it on the 4 levels of existence, the 4 worlds, as the Kabbalists like to call it, as being different reality structures that are still very personal and impersonal the further you go into these worlds. And we'll unpack that a little bit later. You said something quite profound about bringing heaven to earth through a relationship to life and an awakening of consciousness and the application of that consciousness. One of the things you often talk about is the shift of a new collective consciousness and humans stepping into their highest potential. I think that you are leaning in that direction with the statement you just made. So let's break that down for the audience. What do you mean by a collective consciousness, and what is this higher potential that you're speaking of?
Well, so collective consciousness, I mean, we could talk about it from the perspective of like what Carl Jung talks about, of the collective unconscious. We could talk about it from a perspective of spirit, that we are all one as a collective spirit at those highest levels from our origin of eternal kind of essence. Our eternal essence comes from this place of oneness. And we come here, though, into this physical life to have this human experience, right? That we are a spiritual being having a physical experience as a human. And as a humankind, we have a kind of a unified field of mind. Even some of the quantum physicists, it might have been Schrodinger or one of these guys that said, we're asked, like, how many minds are there to observe, right? And the answer is there's only one mind.
Right.
And so we are a collective in a way. And we are perhaps islands in the ocean. So we perceive ourselves as, separate. But when you go down deeper, you look at the islands ultimately connect into the ocean floor, and they are connected. They're all one, coming from one earth, one body. So we're sort of, like that. And to create a leap in collective consciousness and awaken our potentials is about, one, recognizing our oneness rather than coming from this separation consciousness and thinking, just from an egoic perspective about who we are. It's about transcending that illusion of separation and raising our consciousness from beyond just this my personal island, for example, into the vastness, into the whole. And the more we can expand our consciousness beyond just this body, and into, even beyond, what some people might call an astral body, like we go beyond it from this perspective of just identity to higher forms of consciousness, higher dimensions where you see, I am that, but I'm also so much more. The more we can perceive the wholeness and the vastness, the more we come to know ourselves as God or as divine being, as eternal. And that is our highest potential, to fully realize that divine self into this physical life, to become like, not just thinking of ourselves as, well, I'm only human, and I have all these flaws, and, I have all these excuses for why I don't, manifest abundance or, accomplish my goals or whatever it is, and people create all these excuses and limitations. When we're manifesting our highest potential and expanding our consciousness, we don't have those excuses anymore, because we know that we are God. We create our life. We, manifest things out of the quantum field, for example, or from the source. and we become, more like avatars, or we become like, angelic presences walking in the physical, or, like the heroes. You can accomplish so much more and bring that energy and that presence and that awareness in your interactions with other people and help them awaken to it. Because as it's not just about me, it's also about that we're all one. And so we're all here to awaken that fire, that light of consciousness within everybody. And so this is how we would go forward and help create, more of a heaven on earth type of experience.
Well, a lot of people find themselves very interested in the Kabbalah on the level of wanting to learn to manifest things in their lives through magical practicum that is somehow considered to be a left-hand path or an occult type of practice. You're talking about something that's very different, which I personally agree with very strongly. The idea of using a magical practice for one's own personal gratification is a very different thing than what you're talking about here. You're looking to bring about a Messianic understanding of the relationship between the divine and human, as above, so below. Much like what the mystical traditions in just about every major religion are speaking about when they get into what the whole point of being in this religion is for, is to more or less embody the teachings of the divine master and become that which you seek. Is that a fair assessment of what you're presenting?
Yeah, I think that at the core essence, that is what spirituality ultimately was meant to be about. But often in certain religious, like different strains of different religious traditions, they become dogmatic, and then they make the prophet or the Messiah be unobtainable. And then it becomes a mediator between you and the divine. Whereas what we're talking about here is direct. It's direct connection. And it's not, there's no block between you and God. And you don't need to give your power away to some Messiah, because it's ultimately about awakening that, that Christ consciousness within. It's awakening that divinity within. But the key, as you're pointing out, is it's not about just learning these magical practices for the sake of oneself, for the sake of what I want to have or experience at a physical level. There's nothing wrong with wanting to have, an abundant life and to live life to the fullest and all of that, and to create things for ourselves. But we want to, at least from the mystery school tradition that I come from, it's very much about, hey, we're on a mission. We have a mission here, and there's a purpose to this life, and that purpose is a collective purpose. It's not just individual purposes. And the Kabbalistic tradition has always taught, like, okay, we came from this divine state, in the Kabbalistic terms, they might have called it the original Garden of Eden, for example. That is a metaphor. If you go to like Tibetan tradition, it would be the first Shambhala or Shangri-La, the Hopi to have the first world, right? So all these ancient traditions talk about some original divine state that was perfected. And then we somehow devolved or fell out of that into a world that is what we experience today, that's more separate, that's harder, there's more suffering, there's a lot of challenges and hardship to overcome in this physical experience. But they all also prophesy about a time or tell us like, hey, your purpose is to evolve, and we're looking at, there is a way where we can reawaken the divine potential within us, and we are then meant to also bring that heaven to earth. We are meant to create that new Garden of Eden, that new Shambhala, that new Jerusalem, whatever, the fifth world. But it is something that we have to create. When people are looking for a savior, that is like, oh, the power's outside of me. I'm waiting for someone to come and rescue me, to have divine intervention, whether they're waiting for the aliens to come and rescue us, or they're waiting for God to come and rescue us, or, the return of the Messiah. it's all outside of oneself.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Kabbalah says, no, the power is inside of each and every one of us, that each of us are a divine spark from that wholeness. And our role is to bring the divine sparks back together again from separate pieces into an integrated whole. And when we each, it's like we each have a piece of the puzzle. And when we awaken to our piece of the puzzle, and then we start working together, all contributing what we're meant to contribute,
Mm-hmm.
we bring those puzzle pieces back together again, and the picture forms. And that picture of that, divine state, that heaven and earth, whatever you want to call it, that's within our DNA. It's inside of us. It's in our spiritual DNA. It's in our spiritual memory banks. It's in our physical DNA too. And the tree of life, it is our DNA. And it's that map to how we reawaken to that, how we remember that. In Kabbalah, we teach, actually all the knowledge you need is already within you. All the gifts, all the potential, it's already within you. You've just forgotten it, or it's become dormant, and we want to reawaken it. We just want to remind you of what you already know. So we're not really here to teach you anything. We're here to help you remember what you already know. And that awakening is what matters the most, because then you'll remember your piece of the puzzle, your gifts, what you're here to bring. And when you do that, you're going to love it. You're going to have a lot of joy and abundance from it. And you're going to be making a really important contribution to the whole, whatever that is. And then as we all do that, we will create that heaven on earth.
So it's an acknowledgement of the individual gifts that one brings to the table of consciousness and the unified field theory. It's about being in alignment with your true knowledge and purpose and goals for what giving you a real depth of meaning in life. It's not an exercise in intellectual concepts. It's an awakening of the relationship of the primal dualities, which began in the metaphorical stories of the Garden of Eden, which is the tree of knowledge, where it was the knowledge of the primal dualities. Good and evil is what is represented there. That could be male, female. It could be all the polarities we're talking about. It's an acknowledgement of self and other, and the way that flows. And that other includes the divine, which is part of the maxim or axiom of as above, so below.
Well, and so I would actually say knowledge of good and evil is going to be different from the knowledge of gender, like male, female, for example, because they already had gender prior to, in the story. If we go with the Garden of Eden story, you already had Adam and Eve prior to.
There was
eating
one emanated from another. Adam was a primal male, but that the primal female, according to these metaphorical stories, came from the rib of Adam. The way I see that, and these are all allegories for me, is that the divine became flesh for the first time, and then which was a primal separation, and then the primal separation took another step further between the male-female polarities. That's the way I interpret it.
There is also in the original Hebrew word that has been translated as, from the rib of.
Right.
Actually originally meant a mirror image of.
Right. Exactly.
So a mirror image. But Kabbalah even goes further back than the Garden of Eden when it comes to masculine and feminine energies, because you can go all the way back to the source, and you can go to the Shekinah,
right?
Divine feminine. You can go to the creation of the tree of life, where we go from the one to the two poles, and the supernal triad that forms that top triangle of the tree. And those two poles, from a physics perspective, it's from the oneness to expansion energy, but you also have contraction and formation. So we have the outward force, and we have the inward formation, and that is masculine is expansion, contraction, feminine. So these principles of masculine and feminine are not about physical gender necessarily. They're about energy and the generative energy of the universe, and how the universe is created, and everything from that highest spiritual plane all the way down, as above, so below, all the way down into the physical, relies upon these two principles of we can call it masculine, feminine, we can call it yin and yang, yang and yin,
Positive, negative.
Positive, negative, which doesn't mean good and bad. It just means it's more like proton and electron.
Exactly.
You know, it's charge, and they're different. And I think that this is really important. You know, this is a topical kind of conversation in the world today is around gender and gender, you know, fluidity and all of this. And I do believe from a Kabbalistic perspective and from a physics perspective that it's really important for us to recognize the value that the masculine brings and the value that the feminine brings, and that they are, yes, they are equally important, but they are different in function, different in their nature, different in the way that they run energy. Mm-hmm. And that is important, because if you have two things that are the same and they're exactly equal, you don't get dynamic energy. You just have stagnation. And only with the differences and the dance that happens between them, back and forth, this flow, do we then have movement? Do we have the ability to generate, to create, to birth something, into the world or into the next level? Mm-hmm. This is like, I love how Kabbalah brings such clarity to what is masculine, what is feminine, why are they important? Because it's such a confusing topic in our world today when you apply it at a gender, at a gender kind of politics kind of level that's happening, or even within the self. People, young teenagers right now, trying to know who they are, and then they're so confused with all this social kind of pop culture narrative that's happening, and then they don't know who they are. This is why I think things like Kabbalah really can help with ancient wisdom that is not about what's like trendy, but what's eternal, what's universal, what applies always, because it is the universal principles upon which we are created and upon which the universe is formed.
The universal principles of duality and creation. It's going to get more intense from here, so we're going to take a quick break and let the audience digest what was just said. We'll be back with Dr. Theresa Bullard in just a moment.
Expanding on Consciousness is brought to you by the Monroe Institute, a nonprofit organization and leader in consciousness education and research, teaching you how to actively explore and use expanded states of consciousness, providing direct experiences that are deeply personal, uniquely meaningful, and life-changing. Monroe has been helping people create more meaningful and joyful lives through the guided exploration of expanded consciousness for 50 years. Gain the knowledge and understanding you seek to create the life you desire. Learn more about where to start your journey to expanded awareness with Monroe. Visit monroeinstitute.org or check out our Expand Meditation app, available on the App Store or Google Play.
Well, getting back to the creation story in the Garden of Eden, for instance, we're talking about a tree of knowledge. And that knowledge was of good and evil, representing the primal dualities in general. Good and evil were relative terms there. Masculine, feminine, knowledge, wisdom, understanding. Those things are in apparent opposite to one another. And it's through that understanding, through bringing consciousness to that balance of these two poles, which are in apparent opposition, that the middle pillar becomes the pillar of consciousness. Because in order for an electrical circuit to have its way and be useful, it has to have a positive, it has to have a negative, also needs to have a ground. So we're talking about a threefold system, like the Earth, Moon, Sun system that allows all life to exist. Mm-hmm. The knowledge of the polarities is definitely part of Kabbalistic training. Being able to hold those polarities is part of that Kabbalistic training. But we have a lot to unpack just in what we've talked about thus far. I'm sure we have listeners that are sitting there going, wow, this is really speaking to me. And There's so
What
much
are they
more.
talking about?
Right, exactly. There's so much more to what they're saying that we haven't said. So let's try to unpack that.
Can I interject on something there?
Certainly, absolutely.
Just said, because and I think with Kabbalah, there are so many ways to view it. It's very alive, very dynamic, and so there's different ways of interpreting or relating to what the tree is showing us. And when I look at the two pillars of polarity, right, where we can label it expansion, contraction, force and form, masculine, feminine,
right,
wisdom and understanding, and they're juxtaposed as if they're contraries. And what you're talking about is the equilibrium, bringing, finding the balance between them and coming into the middle pillar. And we see that, but you're looking at that from the two-dimensional tree.
Mm-hmm.
When I think of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, we're not actually looking at it's not duality between the pillars of polarity.
Mm-hmm.
I look at the three-dimensional tree where you have the two pillars in front, the light side, and you have the two pillars behind, which are like the shadow side in a way.
Now we're talking more polarities, light, dark.
Yeah. And within every sephira, within every part of the tree, there are, they talk about strengths and weaknesses, vices and virtues. Mm-hmm. And within a sephira, there is the balanced expression of it, which is, the virtue. Mm-hmm. And the virtue. So let's say, for example, in the Sephira Chokhmah, which is wisdom, the virtue is devotion. Mm-hmm. And that devotion ultimately is a devotion to the purpose of divine will.
Right.
And we can say so much more about that. But the vice comes in when we get out of balance mm-hmm. within its own spectrum. Mm-hmm. So lack of devotion.
Right.
Not having that sense of purpose. Would be an imbalance, or becoming too myopic and too fanatical around a particular purpose and not being able to see the greater whole mm-hmm. And adjust to it. These would be examples of going out of the balance point too far one way or too far the other way.
Right.
And every sephira has this kind of a spectrum. Mm-hmm. And so the evil is almost more like when we get out of balance with the middle or the pure expression of it, where the shadow side starts to come in, distortion starts to come in. And so that knowledge of good and evil is, okay, the knowledge of how am I choosing by my own free will to align with that balanced expression of pure divine, because all of these are divine aspects, right? Mm-hmm. Every part of the tree is an expression of divine self. How am I aligning with the divine expression of it versus maybe where am I making choices that are falling out of alignment with that are going against the flow of divine will? And this is, one way that we could define what is good and what is evil is good is what progresses and flows with that divine will to grow and to evolve and to spread the light, or to express in a way that is of the light. Whereas that evil would be to go against that, to go out of alignment with that. Mm-hmm. Sin, the original word for sin meant to miss the mark,
right?
To fall slightly out of alignment. And if you think of, one way people can maybe think of this is like, if I am, if it's like noon, right? Noonday, the sun is right above. And if I'm standing in that middle pillar and I'm fully aligned with it, you look below me, I don't cast much shadow on the ground.
That's right.
I start falling out, kind of going a little bit lopsided and falling out of alignment. Now there's more shadow being cast below me onto the earth.
That's
and
great.
This shadow is where we manifest that darkness, so to speak, where we block the light in a way. Mm-hmm. And we want to get into that place where we're in full alignment, not casting shadows.
Yes, and therein lies the basic message behind the words tikkun olam, which is Hebrew, for those who don't know, meaning to fix the world. It also can be interpreted as raising the sparks. And in the Lurianic tradition, the sparks we're talking about are the sparks of the original creation, which were so intense coming from the divine force as to shatter the vessels that existed to contain those energies. Those vessels are consciousness, packets of consciousness that reside within us, and also divinity as divinity can be understood by the limitations of human consciousness. When that energy came through, it was so intense, it broke those vessels. And the sparks of that explosion are packets of consciousness, individuated consciousness, which apparently, through the study of Kabbalah, in order to attain Messianic consciousness, is to raise those sparks through our consciousness and bring it back to the Creator. The reason I bring that topic up is it was pursuant to something you mentioned before about the raising of consciousness, the raising of sparks, the Messianic message behind that, and what that truly means to become more in alignment with that understanding of the divinity within, so as not to separate it, and to understand that divinity exists everywhere, and that part of your job as a student of Kabbalah is to bring your level of consciousness up, to understand that simple premise. One might say, no matter how evil it looks, that too is God. I just don't see how. I don't understand.
Well, yeah. I mean, so we could say, for example, everything has the divine spark within it. And so even the food that I eat has a divine spark. The water I drink has a divine spark. And by bringing my awareness to it, by recognizing that divine spark within it, I actually help draw it forth. I help bring it out.
Yes.
And this is alchemical. If I were to draw from alchemy for a moment, in alchemy, you look at like the raw materia, and that raw materia the alchemists went and dug in the horse dung, they were going into some of the nastiest places to find their prima materia to work with. And you could call that disgusting, right? It's nasty. But they would see that there's gold. The potential for gold is contained within that. And so they would take that raw materia through the alchemical process to extract, to draw out the eternal essences contained within it. And but they recognized they had to purify. They had to do this formula of separating the pieces out, purifying them, recombining them in perfect proportion, taking them through distillation and refinement, raising the vibration and so forth, to ultimately bring that raw materia to its highest expression. It was in its perfected form. And this is tikkun olam. This is, no matter what it is, we all have that divine spark within, but that divine spark needs to be drawn out, and we have to go through the alchemical process to bring it to its fullest expression. So, and I love like the work in Jungian work, for example, where within the shadow of the self, within the negative ego and the parts of us that we might hide or reject or, be ashamed of, there lies the gold of the self, some gifts even that we have within us that we maybe rejected at some point because we thought it wasn't acceptable, or we were told it wasn't acceptable. And so when we go into the shadow, we can learn to come to that place of accepting that this is part of me too. Doesn't mean I'm going to give excuses to bad behavior. It means I'm going to accept myself and say, okay, I'm not perfect the way I am, but I'm going to strive towards greater perfection. I'm going to strive towards a higher form of expression. And I'm going to, kind of come into greater self-mastery. I'm going to conquer the weaknesses within me. And as we go through that journey, the journey itself is what brings out the gifts, is what brings out the sparks and helps us to heal, to go through tikkun and to rectify. So it's, we're in this experience of duality to learn from it, to learn by our own choices, but also hopefully through our results, to see what works and what doesn't work. And if something's not working, well, you got to do it differently.
And therein lies the gift of free will.
Yes.
Because you can make your own choices based on the knowledge that you now have. So the tree of knowledge is not the bad guy in this story. It's an awareness that there's a polarity in everything, including the consciousness of the individual. perhaps including the consciousness of the one consciousness, that it needs some form of other, an antagonist in the story, in order for it to come to its full understanding of self.
Could be, yeah. I mean, Jungian archetypes often say that the adversary is our greatest teacher.
That is the point. That's the whole purpose of having one, isn't it? So I'm very curious to know how you got this work into your bones.
Into my bones?
Yes, I mean, you obviously are living the Kabbalistic mindset. You exemplify it. You teach it. You've come to it through, training courses. I'm sure you've read a ton of material. I'm sure you're aware of the 3 different schools and how they differ. How did you get this into your bones, into your mindset, so that you fully understood it? Because Kabbalah can be pedantic and confusing, and people spend way too much time thinking about the attributions on the tree of life in the various worlds, and they're just trying to understand all of this information, and it becomes too much. Getting it into your bones is a whole different thing. It's more than just an intellectual pursuit. It's an understanding, a shift in consciousness. How did you get it into your bones?
It's a great question. So I do agree that there are ways that people have do approach Kabbalah that is very intellectual, and it just kind of keeps it in the level of the mind. But ultimately, it is about the practice. Kabbalah is not a path just about the mind. It's a path about life. It's about living it. And one of the things that I so appreciate about my training with the Modern Mystery School is it was always about the tools. Like the theory, you could study the theory all day long, but if you just keep it in the realm of the intellectual, you're never going to understand it.
Right.
And so one of the things that we really focus on is actually application. So we talk about that if you want to ascend your consciousness to greater awareness and to higher dimensional realities and so forth, there is actually a formula for ascension. And that formula it goes from knowledge to understanding to wisdom, but there are steps in between. So the way we get from knowledge to understanding is through life experience, through application, through living it, the practice of it. And so how I got it into my bones first was through living it, the practice. So we learn meditations, rituals, tools, chants, and doing it on a daily basis and making it part of your foundation of life. Humans are habitual. We are creatures of habit, and you're going to have habits one way or another. And most of those habits are indoctrinated and they're not serving you. And what we do in Kabbalah, at least the way I've learned it, is let's repattern your foundation of how you live your life. And let's bring in a ritual. Let's make life into a ritual. Like, let's make a routine that supports your spiritual being, not just in reaction to your physical being. And so we do daily practices, and that integrates it. Then you get direct experience of the tree and of the tools and of the teachings, and it becomes alive in your life, and you learn from your own life. And one of the ways that we teach Kabbalah in the Modern Mystery School is we go through a 10-month ascension journey, where we energetically ascend the tree. So we'll have certain teachings, people will study in between the classes, and then we'll come together. And based on where the knowledge is at for the students, then the teacher can, kind of work with them and adapt the teachings to what is going to be needed to get them to the next level of understanding. And then once that sort of clarity is established, then the right sort of awarenesses are established within the minds of the students, we can energetically ascend, like kind of striking a tuning fork, and then entraining others into the same frequency level, we can ascend and entrain them into the next level of the tree. And it sort of unlocks the gateways within the soul of the person. And that energy, it's almost like, okay, now their aura, their energetic field is vibrating at this new frequency level based on where we are on the tree. And so we strike this tuning fork, it resonates at a new level. What their field is putting out this new frequency, and the world just reflects it back to us. The world is our mirror, our life and the people in our lives, everything becomes our mirror. And so they reflect our own energy back to us. And then we will literally experience the vices and virtues, the strengths and weaknesses of the tree, the intelligences of the tree in our own life. It'll reveal itself to us through our own life experiences. And then when you're studying and understanding the correspondences and you're reflecting on your life experiences, you're like, oh my God, this is my life right now. This is so describing what I'm experiencing. And then we can start having deeper insights into what it's trying to teach us to adjust so that we can come more into that balance point. And so it got into my bones because I lived the tree and been through this ascension journey. I don't even know how many times by now, because I loved it and I did it every year that I could. And then I became a teacher of it. And as I taught it, then I started to actually grow further. So from my own, progression of knowledge to understanding through my own life experience, the next step from understanding up to wisdom is to step into service to others, and others grow in that progression. And as I serve through teaching, for example, as I serve, I learn even more because the students ask me questions that I never thought of, or the way the information flows from the tree through for that person's mind to understand it is completely different than how it might have come through for me. So it's like it becomes more multidimensional, more expanded in the different perspectives and ways of working with it. And through service, we also raise our vibration and expand consciousness. And then when you reach wisdom, the wise man knows he knows nothing, and he empties his cup, or woman, and they empty their cup, they stay humble, they seek new knowledge, they take that knowledge, they apply, they gain wisdom, understanding, they serve, they gain wisdom, they empty the cup, they stay humble, and it goes on and on and on and on and on. There's never an end to it. So it becomes a way of life. And yet our foundation always is rising, and the capacity to which we can hold and understand expands. And so it's through this process that I really came to integrate Kabbalah as a way of life. Working with the tools, living it every day, starting to perceive and recognize what my life was teaching me, or how, different relationships were showing up in relationship to the tree. Well, the more I understand the tree, the more I understand life, the more I understand people,
right.
And all of it. So it informs everything.
And also, by implication of what you just said, you spoke about how life begins to reflect what your consciousness is awakening to, what you need to know. That's how one gets it into their bones as they begin to practice this, become aware that these polarities exist, become aware of the dynamics of life, become aware of the relationship between self and other, and somehow, through some magical occurrence, which may have to do with quantum physics, life begins to reflect back to us what we need to learn. And we begin this process of evolution, interacting with what the Kabbalists call involution. So a higher intelligence is almost meeting us halfway and helps us to move forward, and does so through a creation that can be experienced directly in physical time and space. It's not just a product of imagination. It's not just a product of mental or conceptual stimulation. It's not just something you do on Sunday. It's something that becomes a part of your life.
Yeah, and it's not a hallucination. It's not an illusion. It's a reality that gets manifested.
Right. It's not a product of an ayahuasca journey where you can question it. It becomes a part of you because it is your life. That brings up a lot of questions for me, and I'm sure the listeners are waiting for me to ask them. So I'm going to talk to a physicist about the way in which reality is created through this thing called consciousness, and how the power of Kabbalistic mindset, getting it into one's bones, begins to shift reality. Let's talk about how reality is constructed at the atomic level, and what do we really know about the nature of reality from a physics perspective? Let's start there.
Okay. So it's a big question. I mean, if we were to just start from the quantum physics perspective, which is the most basic foundational, principles that govern the universe, from the ground up, from the subatomic particles up. Number one is the quantum vacuum. Mm-hmm. And the quantum vacuum is not empty, right? Some people, they often, in the classical world, the vacuum meant there was nothing there. It was empty of all things. But in the quantum and in the, I would say in some of the ancient wisdom teachings, both Kabbalistic and Vedic and whatnot, they said it is a plenum. Mm-hmm. So it is a fullness of emptiness. So in a quantum perspective, we would say that in the vacuum, there is infinite possibilities and potentialities, mm-hmm. yet nothing manifested. Like it's all in this virtual state and they're all simultaneously there. And yet nothing is manifested out of it until an observation is made.
Which begins a process of that dynamic called mm-hmm. the sin sum, expansion and contraction. So there seems to be a connection between observation and the dynamic energy starting to move in a quantum flux. Would that be a decent way to speak about it?
Yeah. So like in quantum field theory, for example, they talk about this boiling sea almost of virtual particles popping in and out of existence, but their existence is too short to count it as existence. Mm-hmm. And so in science, in traditional science today, which is still very materialist, and they don't really want to acknowledge that there was an original observer, they would say, well, there was just at some point in time, there was some fluctuation that popped into existence long enough that it then initiated a big bang, mm-hmm. or inflation of the universe, and everything came out from that plenum at that point.
Sounds good.
Yeah, if you want to explain away God, right? If you want to explain away an original intelligence of some kind. So in the Kabbalistic perspective, they would say before that Big Bang moment, right, that there was, and this is more Lurianic Kabbalah, that there was the Ein Sof, the Ein Sof. It was everything and nothing, and everything you could say about it, you could say exactly the opposite. Mm-hmm. And it was everywhere mm-hmm. and nowhere, right? So we could kind of go through that forever. Mm-hmm. That Ein Sof withdrew. In order to bring creation to being, it withdrew, mm-hmm. It contracted. Yes. Contraction being a feminine quality, remember, it created a vessel, and it withdrew from a tiny, infinitesimally small point. In quantum physics, we would call this a singularity point.
Bingo.
Or a true vacuum, mm-hmm. right? True vacuum before we fill it. So first was that contraction. And where the Ein Sof withdrew, the source withdrew and created a true vacuum. But there is nowhere that the Ein Sof cannot be. There's nowhere that infinite source energy cannot be. So as soon as it creates that, it also flows, the energy flows in to fill it. Mm-hmm. And that then becomes that singularity point where it's infinitely dense points of light. That, this unity of all light, all source energy filling this tiny little vacuum, and it becomes so full that tiny little vacuum space cannot contain it anymore because its infinite energy is flowing into it. And that is where you have the shattering of the vessel, mm-hmm. the explosion, the Big Bang, and then, all the stuff, the particles, the sparks, the souls, everything comes out, the light, everything starts coming out. Right. And then from there, it scatters all around. And then the tree of life comes in, the tree was kind of there first as 10 emanations as it expanded out. but then even that shattered, and then all the parts had to be regathered at some point, and then the tree of life is kind of the way in which it's stabilized.
And I'm getting the impression now that the astute listener is coming to a conclusion that there is some connection between what the mystics knew and what the quantum theorists are finding out. If you want to find out something about how to apply this knowledge, you're going to have to tune in next time. Next week, we continue this conversation with Dr. Theresa Bullard. For now, keep thinking about that vacuum. There's a lot of potential there. See you next week.
Be certain to tune in again to Expanding on Consciousness to become informed on the fascinating field of consciousness studies and its applications. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the guests and the host. They do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Monroe Institute. Expanding on Consciousness is underwritten and produced by the Monroe Institute, copyright 2023, and is broadcast by permission. Reproduction or redistribution without the express written consent of Monroe Institute is prohibited by law. For more information about Expanding on Consciousness, visit our website at monroeinstitute.org or connect with us on the socials. Thank you for listening.